All right, Mark 14, 32 through 42. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, why are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
Every war has decisive battles, but the decisive battle is not always the final battle. For example, in September and October of 1781, General George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette cornered General Cornwallis, the British commander, at the Battle of Yorktown. It was the decisive battle that led to American independence. However, the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war, did not take place until right at 2 years afterwards, in 1783. Then there was the American Civil War. It came to an official end in April of 1865 when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. But the outcome of the war was probably decided at Vicksburg, Mississippi, when Grant and Pendleton cut the Confederate Army in half. Now, that was a couple of years prior. And then there is the end of World War II in Europe, which officially was in May of 1945. But the decisive battle took place nearly a year earlier when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy and recovered Europe from the hands of Hitler. So that battle, 2 months long, 1944, the decisive battle, but the end of the war would come later. You know, all of those battles, those wars, you know, even though they happened so many years ago, they still profoundly affect our lives. Can you imagine what life would be like had World War I gone differently, or had the Civil War gone differently, or had the battle for the American independence from Britain gone differently? Those were all life-changing events. And all of these battles, even though they happened so many years ago, even before probably most of us were born, continue to affect us. Well, I mean, World War II, some of you were born and lived through that. I didn't mean to imply that some of you were so old that you might remember the American Revolution. Yeah. But so much for those battles. I want to talk about another battle. One that happened some 2,000 years ago that changed our lives more dramatically than any other battle possibly could. It was a battle, but not a conventional battle, a spiritual one, spiritual warfare. Now, you're probably thinking that the battle I'm referring to took place on the cross at Calvary, but that's not the case. Now, it is true that the war for our souls was won on Calvary, but the decisive battle was waged in the Garden of Gethsemane. So when Jesus took Peter and James and John with him, he asked them to stand with him while he fought this battle through prayer. But these disciples were of no help. They slept through the whole thing, the most significant battle in the history of the world, and they slept through it. So we might wonder, why could they not hang in there with Jesus when he implored them to do so? Well, of course, physically speaking, they were tired and they were sleepy from the day's events. But it was also determined by God the Father that God the Son would go through this thing alone. You know, thinking of this event with Jesus doing the spiritual warfare in the Garden of Gethsemane and his three closest disciples, they're with him asleep. And this just happens to be the Sunday that we go to daylight savings time. So I know that you all got 1 hour less rest last night than you would ordinarily. And the temptation to go to sleep is likely very strong. But I'm going to ask you to hang in there with me as we do this spiritual warfare. One of the things required for spiritual warfare is that you must be awake. So here we go. All right. Spiritual warfare involves not only being alert, but it involves prayer and intense prayer. But spiritual warfare also involves clear thinking to counteract the misguided messages that are out there. And there's a verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5 that I think speaks directly to what we're talking about in the Garden of Gethsemane. Where Paul says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive in obedience to Christ. Well, Jesus prevailed against the spiritual wickedness in high places in the Garden of Gethsemane, even though it seemed on the surface that he was being defeated by the forces of evil. But in reality, Jesus prevailed by counteracting misguided ideas about God. And we want to do the same. So we're going to talk about the misguided ideas about God that Jesus faced in his spiritual warfare in this battle that he conducted in the Garden of Gethsemane. The first misguided idea about God is this, that there is another way to God other than the one he prescribed. Okay, how do we see that unfold? Well, we go to verses 34 and 35. And 36, he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. Going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Do you hear what Jesus is asking God for in this prayer? Is there some way to accomplish this mission of bringing salvation to man other than by the way that you have described, the drinking of this cup? Well, what is this cup that Jesus refers to? Well, it's the wrath of God. If you were to go through the Old Testament and even into a Revelation, you would see that the cup always represents God's judgment against the nations. And so when Jesus is talking about drinking from the cup, he's talking about taking the full wrath of God upon himself. Now, we understand to some degree the agony of the cross. When Jesus is being flogged to ribbons, we flinch. When the nails are driven through Jesus' hands and feet, we shrink back. And when the crown of thorns is thrust into Jesus' brow, we wince. The physical agony is something we can relate to. That's why it isn't so hard for us to appreciate what Jesus did for us when he submitted to such torturous treatment on the cross and the floggings that preceded it. But what about the agony of Gethsemane? That phrase is in some of the songs that we sing. But can we relate to it? Do we have any idea just how serious, how severe this agony was that Jesus bore in Gethsemane. When Jesus stepped into that place of prayer in Gethsemane, he was facing, or maybe I should say tasting, for the first time, nothing less than the wrath of God against all sin. That suffering cannot be calculated. Even at the death that Jesus was facing was the relatively painless method of lethal injection, which is sometimes used in our country. The suffering, the agony that he endured in Gethsemane would have been no less than it was with the crucifixion facing him. Mark tells us, or he quotes Jesus in saying that his soul is agonized to the point of death. John relates to us that what happened with Jesus is that when he sweat, great drops of blood came out. It's a very rare but real malady called hemodiatrosis, where the blood vessels that surround the sweat glands pop, which comes as a result of high anxiety, and blood comes out the sweat glands. That's what Jesus was going through. This was the type of agony that he was enduring. He was tasting the cup of wrath from God. And so we have to ask the question as Jesus prays, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Another way of expressing Jesus' request would be something like this. If there is another way that we can accomplish the salvation of man, if there is another way for redemption to be secured, other than drinking this cup of wrath and the floggings and the crucifixion that is to come, I know all things are possible for you. Is there another way? Would not this have been the perfect time for God the Father to respond to his Son and say, Son, I am so glad you reminded me of that. There is another way. One of the ways is people can choose whatever religion they want to choose. They can believe whatever they want to believe. As long as they are sincere and are good persons, they're in. That would have been the opportunity. That would have been the ultimate time to say that. But as John tells us in chapter 14, verse 6, which was just the night before, when Jesus has his disciples, what does he say in the 6th verse of chapter 14? I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. So Jesus in the garden at his greatest moment of agony is asking, is there another way? Was he doing that for his sake? Possibly, yeah. But even more so for our sakes. Well, how is that? See, this puts to bed for good the idea that there might be some other way out there. That you might be able to get to God through some other means than through Christ. A few weeks ago, I was involved in a conversation with several people, half a dozen or so of us. And one of the men spoke up and was talking about this very idea, about the exclusivity of Jesus as the Savior, the only Savior. And he was not in agreement, even to the point of saying somewhat mockingly, oh yeah, well, those of you who come to me through Jesus, that's fine. But for the rest of you who have some other religion, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu or something like that, well, then you can just go to hell. So that's the perspective that he thinks, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, is too narrow. And the prayer that Jesus offers in the garden, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. If there is another way, show me the way. Now, of course, the man that I was having the conversation with was talking to all of us, but he looked straight at me when he said that, and so he was pretty much asking for a response. So I responded and said something like this. Your point sounds compassionate from a particular perspective that's held by many. But think about the perspective of Christ. If there is another way, what did Jesus do with his life when he laid it down? He wasted it because it would not have been necessary. Just go to God through some other way. Have your sins forgiven by some other means. God would be just as happy with our good works as he would with some other approach, as he would with the sacrifice of his own son. So Jesus is letting it be known unmistakably, it's unmistakably clear that there is no other way to God than through Jesus. Unless Jesus drinks the cup of God's wrath and goes to the cross, there is no hope for sinners. A gospel that promises any way to God other than the way that he has prescribed through the blood of the Lamb is misguided, it's deceptive, and it is powerless to save. This is why Gethsemane is so critical. At Gethsemane, Jesus earnestly petitioned the Father to reveal another way to save his people from their sins. If there had been another way, God would surely have revealed it. But there is no other way. Jesus had to drink the cup of wrath and go to the cross. The point is this: you cannot avoid or bypass the cross and get to God. You must get to God through the means that he has prescribed, through his Son crucified. So that's the first misguided idea about God that Jesus confronts in the Garden of Gethsemane and his battle, a spiritual battle. The second one is this, is that God is not a God of wrath, he's a God of love. Well, we hear this all the time, don't we? Today it's rare to hear about God as being angry or as wrathful. Consumers don't want to hear about a God of wrath. They want to hear exclusively about a God of love. Now, I understand that. The attribute of God's love is powerful, it's attractive, and we are so endeared to it, to God being a God of love, that the idea of God also being a God of wrath just doesn't seem to mix for us. So we think sometimes it has to be one or the other. God either has to be a God of love or a God of wrath, but he cannot be both. But this is the way we counteract that kind of thinking, that God is a God of love, and he is a God of wrath, and there is no contradiction between the two. In fact, the wrath of God proves the love of God. Let me explain this way. Loving people get angry, not in spite of their love, but because of it. The more deeply you love someone, the more angry you get if you see the person you love being abused or destroyed or treated unjustly, right? So if someone is abusing or hurting your child or your grandchild, what emotions rise up in you? Well, there's anger and there is love. Both of those emotions come up at the same time. Anger is an indication of love. It's not the antithesis of love. If you don't get angry when someone tries to hurt or destroy someone who belongs to you, it's a pretty good indication that you don't have a whole lot of love for the person who belongs to you. Here's something else for you to chew on. If God is not a God of wrath, then he cannot also be a God of justice. A few weeks ago, I watched a documentary on Netflix. I like to watch documentaries. I find them fascinating. But this particular one was on Nazi hunters. So it was when, I guess, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, there were still some Nazis hiding out somewhere in South America. And there were some Israelis who were tracking them down because there were not any governments who were interested. So the Nazi hunters decided that they would track them down, and so they would be successful in locating the war criminals, and were looking to bring them to justice. But because of bureaucratic red tape and because people wouldn't cooperate with extradition and so forth, it was dawning on these Nazi hunters that they had done the hard work of finding these men who had, of course, taken on new identities and new careers and disguised their past. But now it appeared that they were going to get away literally with murder. If you believe in a God of justice, though, even though you might get away with something in this life, you still have to face God on the day of judgment. And when we talk about Judgment Day, it's kind of a frightful thing. It's something that we're just kind of put off by. But, there is a degree of comfort in knowing that God is a God of justice. Because what does it prove? It proves that his love is real. Let's look at it like this. Say if God was just a God who just loves everybody, and the war criminals of the world and the despots of the world who've murdered millions of their own people, and people who've done all kinds of atrocious things, nothing would ever happen to them in this world or in the one to come. And so if that were the case, there wouldn't be a whole lot of reason to think that God loved us all that much, or else he would indicate the value that he has for those who have been hurt by perpetrators. The idea of the wrath of God and the love of God go together. Doesn't seem like they do, but they do. But there's something else that goes together with the wrath of God, and that is the value of a human being. If you don't believe in a God of wrath, you have no idea of your real value. A God without wrath does not pursue a cross. A God without wrath isn't moved to pay for sin or be angry about wickedness. He just lets us do whatever we want to do without any fear of consequences. But that's a God who pays nothing, who sacrifices nothing, and gives up nothing in order to save you. You know that you are valuable in God's eyes because the only way to redeem you, was by crushing his Son in the Garden of Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane, by the way, is olive press. When Jesus sweat the blood, it's an indication that spiritually he is being crushed. We have to imagine that Jesus was thinking of Isaiah 53 at that particular time as he was being crushed for our iniquities. But that's what it took. Along with the bloody sacrifice on the cross in the hours that would follow, that's how much God values you. To believe in a gospel that doesn't require anything would seem to indicate that we're not really worth all of that much if it doesn't take that much to redeem us. But without wrath and anger, you just can't have a loving God, and you would never know how valuable you are to him. C.S. Lewis, a brilliant writer who is quoted often by preachers, including me, I'm about to do. But he wrote a book called Letters to Malcolm. Malcolm was a friend of his. And Malcolm one day wrote a letter to C.S. Lewis. He didn't like the idea of an angry God. So here's what he said to Dr. Lewis. I just don't like this idea of an angry God who's personally angry. Instead, I think of God's justice like an electrical wire. A live wire doesn't get angry when you break it. It shocks you. So if you break the rules of God's justice, it shocks you. But I don't like the idea that God gets personally angry. In his response to Malcolm, C.S. Lewis wrote this, My dear Malcolm, what do you suppose you've gained by substituting the image of a live wire for that of an angered majesty? You have shut us all up in despair, for an angry God can forgive, but electricity cannot. It's a wise response to a misguided idea. And without the wrath of God, you cannot have a God of love, nor can you know how much you are valued by God unless you embrace the idea that God is a God of wrath and he is also a God of love, that the two do not contradict each other. And so now we come to the third and final misguided idea about God that Jesus fought against in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's this. If you are in the will of God, everything will go well for you. We like to believe that, don't we? Well, if I am obedient to God, if I'm faithful to God, my life is going to come out great. I'm going to be healthy. I'm not going to be caught in any accidents. I'm not going to be, dealing with, failures in business or anything like that. But think about Jesus. Was he not faithful and obedient perfectly? Now, Jesus pleads for God to provide another way, realizing that while he was yet pleading that there was no other way. And so he yields to the will of the Father. And what happens? Does everything go well for Jesus? The best way to answer that question is with another question. Could things have gone worse from Jesus from a pure human standpoint? Jesus, perfectly obedient, perfectly faithful, and yet God treated him as though he were utterly disobedient. Does that mean God didn't love him? When you pray earnestly and God doesn't come to your rescue and instead allows terrible things to happen to you, does that mean God does not love you? Well, this is one of the great battlefields of the mind that Jesus fought against in Gethsemane. It's so easy for us to believe that success and prosperity and happiness are signs of God's approval, while anguish and heartache and suffering are indications of God's displeasure with you. This is one of the great misguided ideas that the human race buys into wholesale. But Jesus fought this battle for you. When you go through times of anxiety, times of fear, times of doubt, you are vulnerable to the misguided idea that if God loved you, he wouldn't let such things happen to you. Hang on to the victory that Christ won for you in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now I want to tie up a loose end for us. But before I do that, I am sure that you have a question that you would like to ask me. Some of you are still asleep. Let's try it again. All right, on count of three. 1, 2, 3. Hey, all right. I'm so glad you're awake now. And I'm glad you asked, so what? Because by asking that question, here's what you're asking. What can I take away from what I've heard today that will make a difference in my life? Well, I'm going to build up to that by reminding you of the victories that Christ won for you at the Battle of Gethsemane, and then I'm going to leave you with one final thought that, if you believe it, will change your life forever. But first, I want to remind you of the battles that Christ fought for you and the victories that he won for you at Gethsemane. Number one, when you go through times of anxiety, times of fear, times of doubt, and are vulnerable to the misguided idea that if God loved you, he wouldn't let such things happen to you, hang on to the victory that Christ won for you in the Garden of Gethsemane. Number two, when you struggle with the urge, actually, I'm going in reverse order, so you just heard number three. Now number two. When you struggle with the urge to dismiss the idea of a God of wrath in favor of a God of love, remember that Christ won the struggle for you at Gethsemane. He shows us in poignant terms that the love of God cannot exist apart from the wrath of God. And now, point number one. When you are tempted to think that there cannot possibly be only one way to God, one path to redemption, remember the battle that Christ won for you, the victory that he attained for you at Gethsemane. Now, here's why all of these spiritual battles against misguided ideas about God that we just talked about matter so much. In 1 Corinthians 15, Romans chapter 5. No, I want to do the 1 Corinthians 15. Maybe I'm still awake. Not awake. I'll have some non-caffeinated beverage. All right. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to Jesus as the last Adam or the second Adam. Now, the first Adam also came to a garden. God called him to obey in regard to a tree, but he didn't. He listened to some misguided ideas about God. So consequently, he found himself cut off from fellowship with God. And so Adam and Eve hid themselves from God because they were naked. When the second Adam entered, he came to a garden. It was the garden that God told him to go to, the Garden of Gethsemane. And this Adam, this second Adam, obeyed. And as a result, he too was cut off from fellowship with God. And he too was naked when he was nailed to the cross. You have a problem with that? It just doesn't seem fair, does it? It doesn't seem fair to us that the second Adam should obey God perfectly and yet be treated as though he blatantly disobeyed, like the first Adam. But here's the good news. The second Adam was representing us in the Garden of Gethsemane as surely as the first Adam was representing us in the Garden of Eden. And now Romans 5:19, for as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Do you understand what the second Adam has done for us? He took our place. That's what the representative view means. Jesus would rather be cut off from God than have you and me cut off from God. He would rather endure the fullness of God's wrath as though he had committed every sin that has been ever committed than have you drink from the cup of his wrath. In the garden, he tasted and he felt the wrath of God for us so that you and I could taste and see that the Lord is good. Let's pray.